Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this sitting, which is the 33rd meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today, pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, we are meeting as part of our study of the role of the Canada Border Services Agency in the H2O highway corridor and port clearance practices. And we have the good fortune for this first hour of welcoming three witnesses from Transport Canada: Sonia Reid, Director General of Marine Policy; Christian Day, Director General of Transportation and Economic Analysis and Chief Economist; and Heather Moriarty, Director of Ports and Seaway Policy. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Mr. Chair, honourable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security today. My name is Sonia Reid. I'm the Director General of Marine Policy at Transport Canada, and I'm joined, as the Chair noted, by my colleagues Heather Moriarty and Matthew Grenier. J'apprécie l'occasion de participer à cette...
I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this important and topical study on the role of the Canada Border Services Agency, as well as supporting departments such as Transport Canada in port clearance practices and, more broadly, in supporting maritime trade along the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Corridor.
I understand my colleagues from Canada Border Services Agency appeared before this committee on March 26 to speak to the agency's role in supporting trade and the Canadian economy, and to provide an overview of their services vis-à-vis marine cargo examinations and inspections. As my agency colleagues noted, decision-making on port infrastructure and supply chains implicate multiple departments, and that is why Transport Canada, alongside Global Affairs Canada and the New Major Projects Office, along with many other departments and agencies, are working together on Canada's trade diversification and supply chain fluidity objectives.
As we delve into Transport Canada's role, I would first like to speak to the department's mandate in the marine domain, and then specifically speak to how we work with the agency.
Le mandat global.
Transport Canada's overall mandate is to ensure that Canadians have a transportation system that is safe, secure, efficient, environmentally responsible, and technologically advanced. A system that supports economic growth and improves accessibility across all modes of transport.
In the marine context, this covers a wide range of responsibilities, including regulating navigation and marine security, overseeing port authorities, enforcing vessel safety standards, and protecting the marine environment from pollution. More specifically, as Director General of Marine Policy, I am responsible for policy leadership related to the Canada Marine Act, the oversight framework for Canada Port Authorities and the St. Lawrence Seaway, transportation economic policy frameworks for domestic and international shipping in Canada, and broader system-level issues that influence how marine transportation supports Canada's economic and trade objectives. I'm also responsible for advancing Canada's marine transportation economic policy objectives at key international fora within the global marine sector, as well as for developing, negotiating, and implementing international marine conventions and domestic legislation and regulations. Le système de transport maritime du Canada est composé d'une...
Canada's marine transportation system comprises a variety of marine assets, public and private ports, as well as the Canada Port Authorities, which represent Canada's 17 largest and most strategic ports. These ports and the Seaway are vital to the government's trade objectives. As such, there is a renewed focus on ensuring this critical trade infrastructure is appropriately managed and capitalized to deliver. I would like to highlight 2 ways in which Transport Canada is supporting these objectives.
First, Transport Canada has recently launched the $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund that will deliver funding to build and improve trade infrastructure that connects Canada with the objective of unlocking access to new global markets and help double non-U.S. exports. Transport Canada will deliver this program in partnership with other government departments and agencies, including the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Although I'm not responsible for leading this program, my team and I, along with others, provide advice on how proposed projects align with Canada's supply chain and trade diversification needs. And this brings me to the second area of work I would like to highlight, collaboration with the Canada Border Services Agency. As you know, Budget 2025 announced that the agency would work with Transport Canada and Global Affairs Canada to identify additional ports for container import and export designation, particularly in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region like Quebec City and Hamilton. As Transport Canada makes investments in transportation projects and the governance of marine transportation corridors, we must work strategically with our colleagues at the agency. This necessitates taking a corridor-level approach when assessing and allocating resources that consider the full supply chain beyond one port. While the agency is ultimately responsible for decisions related to the allocation of their resources, including new services, Transport Canada provides economic analysis and policy advice on how a proposed project or investment could contribute to Canada's economic priorities, including supply chain fluidity, where there are capacity constraints, resiliency, and trade diversification. Nous vous remercions pour l'occasion de...
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee, and we will welcome your questions.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reid. And we know that you will have other points to add, and that will certainly be possible during the question and answer round. We will begin with 6 minutes to Madam Kirkland.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate your introduction, Ms. Reid, and you mentioned strategic ports, and I happen to be a member of Parliament for Oshawa, and I think that Oshawa can be a strategic port, albeit, I think often overlooked. I'll touch on that a little bit, as well as the CBSA collaboration and in those additional ports to be identified. I do appreciate that Transport Canada and you also would provide economic analysis or policy advice. If I think I got that right from what you said, correct? Yes. So, in understanding that, Transport Canada responsible for the overall performance of our transportation system, as you mentioned, the committee recently heard from Ian Hamilton, who's president and CEO of the Hamilton-Oshawa Port Authority, HOPA. He said he said clearly CBSA is the biggest roadblock to growth at the Port of Oshawa. So do you see that as a barrier, and do you know why it persists within our system?
What I will say about, our working relationship with Canada Border Services Agency is that we have a very collaborative relationship with them. We work with them to provide, as I noted, economic and policy advice to support kind of resource allocation decisions across the full spectrum of ports in Canada. And we work closely with the Port of Hamilton, of course, Port of HOPA, as well, in respect of their infrastructure needs. So we recognize the importance that CBSA services play in respect of the different ports, and we work very collaboratively with them in respect of their decisions around resource allocations.
Mm-hmm. So are you aware that there is no CBSA presence at the Oshawa Port?
My understanding is the port really, it's the Hamilton-Oshawa Port Authority, so it's actually one single port, although albeit has multiple locations because of the amalgamation of Oshawa, which of course you would know. I know that they have recently approved, I believe, they provided recently a preliminary approval for a sufferance warehouse in Hamilton, I believe, related to a project there.
Okay. So as the Oshawa Member of Parliament, I often hear a lot about Hamilton in terms of the Hamilton-Oshawa Port Authority. And, I feel that it's important that Oshawa doesn't get forgotten in that. And so that's why my questions are very specific. Are there any actions that Transport Canada can take to coordinate with CBSA to resolve? Right now, a port cannot move if a port can't move containers, which we can't really because CBSA clearance isn't available, it feels more like a system failure than an operational issue. So is there anything that Transport Canada can do to coordinate with CBSA to resolve it?
So I think that there's a couple of different layers to that question. The first thing would, of course, be a capacity and a project or a facility that would be moving containers. And, you know, the understanding what is going to be moved through a port. So that's normally where we start with that. I know that there's a lot of different decisions that go into, and CBSA maybe also, as they were here earlier, can talk about, you know, the designation process for first ports of arrival. But those are often business decisions, and we would work with, obviously, the Port Authority and project proponents if they were looking for those types of opportunities.
Okay, so just to clarify, it would be project driven. So a project would have to sort of be placed in front of you for consideration, in front of the planners for consideration, in order for that to move forward?
So in the normal course, we would look at that in terms of, is there a project or is there an initiative underway which would require CBSA services in order to advance, and the conversation would orient around that. The two have to go.
Okay, so we've heard that trained officers on the ground are essential, right, for anything to be able to happen in Oshawa. So from a system planning perspective, you know, is there a performance or a concern, you know, other than a project? Is that the only way to get CBSA presence sort of at the Oshawa port?
I would have to defer to colleagues at CBSA in that regard.
Okay, how much time do I have left? 1 minute. I know you're totally port. Maybe this will go to others. I know we're not talking about airports, but I just thought I would ask this question to you because you may have the answer. Interestingly, I was talking to firefighters from Oshawa this morning, along with International Association of Firefighters, as was mentioned, and given that they're concerned that Canada is not aligned with international civil aviation organizations. I'm not sure if you're aware with that in terms of, you know, our firefighting capabilities at airports. For instance, when President Joe Biden came to Canada, you know, we had to make sure the Ottawa airport had the proper fire safety that matched what they had in the U.S. Are you aware of any of that?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Totally not. It's not on any of your wavelengths there? Oh, okay. Well, I asked the question. We'll have to ask it to the right person next time. All right, that's good. I'm great. Thanks.
Madame Akan pour 6 minutes.
Ms. Akan for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming to our committee today. Since 2018, the government has been focused on modernizing Canada's ports, from assessing ways to improve transportation systems to support Canada's competitiveness in the global stage. So recently, the Prime Minister announced the Contrecoeur Container Terminal project that has started work. Although the committee's principal mandate concerns security infrastructure at Canada's strategic marine ports, it's also important to recognize that the improvements to customs container processing are closely linked to the effectiveness and resilience of our supply chains. So my first question will be, the National Supply Chain Task has emphasized that the port congestion must be addressed before any reforms can yield their full benefits. So this government is part of the process to streamline federal approvals and to cut red tape. What steps has Transport Canada taken to alleviate congestion in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway?
So the Government of Canada has been working closely with ports regarding their infrastructure needs across the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway system in terms of projects that have been put forward. There are a number of projects that have been funded throughout the Great Lakes system, particularly at the ports of Hopa, but also at the ports of Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and at the Port of Quebec. To name a few, I think Contrecoeur would obviously be the most recent and probably one of the largest, more significant projects that have been put forward in that regard, and that project will be increasing the port's capacity by 60%, which is the largest Eastern Port expansion in Canadian history. So it'll add over 1.15 million TEUs of additional capacity there. And recognizing that this is also ensuring that we're able to kind of get ahead of the curve in looking ahead to what the forecast volume demands will be, and how do we ensure that port congestion does not become an issue that slows down Canada's ability to grow and to diversify its trade.
Thank you very much. So additionally on that work, how is Transport Canada working with seaway authorities and port operators to address the choke points during the peak shipping seasons?
We have had ongoing conversations in terms of, understanding the causes for how, these choke points kind of appear in our system. We're continuing our analysis in terms of the fluidity of the supply chain, and when those occur, sometimes those are the result of unforeseen events. Sometimes that congestion happens as a result of weather events or other temporary disruptions. But we work across the modes with rail, with road, and with the ports to identify areas of concern and to identify potential solutions.
Thank you very much. Could you also speak to the infrastructure investments that have been made to modernize Canada's ports through the National Trade Corridors Fund and the improvements on our clearance ecosystem?
So there are a number of investments that have been made throughout. Excuse.
Ouais.
Thank you. So there are a number of investments that were made under previous programs under the National Trade Corridors Fund program that included port projects that required new or expanded CBSA services. This included, for example, the project at Dew Point, the Port of Nanaimo in BC. The Contrecoeur actually was first announced under the NCTF program with a contribution of $150 million from the Government of Canada, as well as $130 million contribution from the province of Quebec. There were additional initiatives at the Port of Halifax, as well as the Port of St. John, as well as the Port of Argentia in Newfoundland, all of which were also required additional CBSA services.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reid. Has Transport Canada conducted any assessment to identify ports that have strategic potential, which requires the federal support for the modernization?
So through the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund, which was recently launched, the first stream of that fund is an invitation process. And so that, through the auspices of that funding, which was launched earlier in March, I believe, we've started that process of working with individual ports.
Thank you very
and
much.
other project proponents, I should say. It's not limited to ports.
Thank you very much. Do I have time?
No.
Okay.
Merci, Madame McCann. Madame de
Thank you, Ms. Akan. 6 minutes to Ms. de Bellefeuille, please. Do you need your earphone? Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here. I'll ask you to be speedy when answering me. So just some yes or no answers. I have 2 quick questions. So I've understood that Transport Canada, first and foremost, plays a strategic and coordinator role in developing Canadian supply chain fluidity. Have I understood that correctly? You play a strategic role?
That's part of our role, yes.
Alors, est-ce que vous...
Perfect. So would you consider that when there is congestion of containers waiting for clearance in a point of entry, that this is a concerning issue for overall supply chain?
We would work with, responsible entities if there were port congestion issues related to clearance.
Mais vous savez, par exemple,
And you know, for example, that in Montreal, there really is congestion currently and has been for some time. There are containers waiting for clearance. So what I'm asking is, do you believe that when there is congestion in the Port of Montreal, that has an impact on the supply chain?
non.
Yes or no?
Port would have impact on the supply chain.
Provisionnement. Alors, vous nous avez dit
So earlier, you were telling us that Transport Canada is working on projects to try and improve supply chain and fluidity. So would you be open to Transport Canada piloting a cooperation with the Border Service Agency to even apply tariffs to clearance along the Grand Lakes, in the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway for small municipalities? For example, in Valleyfield, we need 2 officers twice a month. And we're going to try and decongest the Port of Montreal through that, and we're going to monitor that. Would you be open to such innovative, creative measures to develop small municipal ports without them becoming points of entry?
So 2 things. I would note that I'm not aware of specific congestion issues related to clearance requirements in the Port of Montreal at this time. But the second part of that, with respect to collaboration with the CBSA, as noted, and as was announced in Budget 2025, we were working with CBSA and Global Affairs to look at opportunities in terms of the expansion of CBSA services in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence corridor.
Alors, ce qu'on comprend, c'est qu'il y a beaucoup d'efforts.
So what we're understanding is that the government has made significant efforts in points of entry like the Port of Montreal. Even the Quebec City port is significant. But other than the Port of Hamilton, we're not making use so much of these other small ports. So we need to be creative. We need to think outside of the box and support these smaller ports who could bring in officers a few times a month and have regional impacts. So is the department open to discussions and negotiations to run a trial to try on these solutions to find a solution? Because, Ms. Reid, it's clear that there will never be enough money at the department to bring in all of the clearance that needs to happen for these seaways. So is the department open to proposals for pilot projects to give a trial run to other solutions?
In terms of, the rules around clearance and the clearance of containers specifically, I would have to defer to my colleagues at CBSA, and we will continue to work collaboratively with them in respect of the need and the expansion of potential services along
Je ne
the
veux pas vous
Great Lakes
interrompre, mais mon temps court.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do know that this goes through the CBSA, but your department plays a strategic role to try and get the supply chain circulating such that there's the least congestion possible. And there is congestion currently on the St. Lawrence and in the Great Lakes. So if you were to decide that this project would be the strategic measure to take, your department would be a major decision maker to trial these solutions that could be creative and innovative.
We have committed, and the Government of Canada committed, that, with CBSA, Transport Canada, and Global Affairs would work collaboratively, and we will continue to do so.
Alors, dites-moi.
So tell me, would you be open to discussing pilot projects? Would you be open to thinking outside of the box to experiment with the creative solutions to clear containers at a small scale in small ports?
We will continue to work collaboratively with CBSA and the Department of Global Affairs to look at, solutions for expansion of port services from CBSA.
Combien qu'il me reste de temps?
How much time is remaining? So I just would like to tell you, Ms. Reid, that we know that in Quebec, there are two major ports. It's 40 minutes from Valleyfield. I think it's reasonable to suggest to bring in officers twice a month, and we would appreciate your openness. I hope we will be able to agree.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Thank you, Ms. de Bellefeuille. Now we'll give the floor to Mr. Lloyd for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses. Do you, in your capacity as maritime transport, work with like helicopter certifications at all? No.
Sorry,
Okay.
I do not.
I was wondering if you could give me thoughts, in our previous study on combating auto theft, there's been some recommendations related to port policing. I guess back in the 90s and previous to that time, there was a robust port policing program in this country, and that was replaced. We've had witnesses tell us that it's very difficult when CBSA doesn't have jurisdiction in certain areas, and that there's cross-jurisdictional issues that are preventing the interdiction of smuggled goods, stolen goods. What are the thoughts about port policing right now at Transport Canada?
So we work with the Canada Port Authorities from a security perspective to look at vulnerabilities, and the department has been looking at kind of the security plans of the individual ports and to address and to identify potential vulnerabilities. What I would say in terms of port policing is that, and a lot of this, of course, those decisions happened quite a long time ago in terms of the port policing, is that the decision was taken in order to streamline and simplify accountabilities in respect of policing. The ports do have security capacity, but they are also working with the RCMP and with local police in terms of policing and responsibility for criminal activities at the port. And the intention at that time and the continued intention is really to make sure that that is that the accountabilities are clear in terms of responsibility for policing at ports.
Say that outcome was successful based on that intention?
I think that the accountabilities have been clarified as a result of that movement. I don't have any data.
Accountabilities have been clarified, but who is being held accountable when vehicles are being stolen from our ports?
Excuse me, Chair, I don't...
Stolen and transported through our port system.
So I think the issue with respect to, the movement of stolen vehicles is a very complicated process. Obviously, they are coming in or they come in containers into the ports. So it's not necessarily that policing, a port police presence, like a separate port police presence, would address that issue more than in the context of the existing municipal and RCMP activities. What I can say is that, they have, that Transport Canada has been working across federal security partners, including, port authorities, the RCMP, to create a National Port Security Committee to provide a forum for federal departments and agencies, police services, including the local police services, who would be best positioned to.
According to a letter sent to the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Public Safety, and the Minister of Industry back in September by the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, they stated that the withdrawal of Canada Border services from the Port of Valleyfield in 2024 reduced clearance capacity of that region. My question is, why did the government allow for the withdrawal of CBSA from the Port of Valleyfield despite warnings that it would reduce clearance capacity?
I would have to defer to my colleagues at CBSA.
Okay. And what was the assessment process conducted? Was there an assessment that Transport Canada conducted before the removal of CBSA from the Port of Valleyfield?
That would not have been within our responsibilities.
Okay. And okay, I guess then my next question, if you're not responsible for the CBSA's involvement at the port, there's another question. In February, the Minister of Transport said that there's no question that our ports are strategic gateways that will help us double our export to markets beyond the United States. They also noted that to expand trade to destinations beyond the U.S., a significant share of goods will have to transit through ports. However, our current port policy is not meeting this objective. Committee members were told in February that ports are critical to doubling exports to markets other than the United States, but what has the government done since then to reduce capacity constraints at these strategic waterways?
Since February?
Well, since in the last year.
Okay. Well, I would point to the launch of the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund, which was announced in the fall and launched a few weeks ago, and has started the process of identifying and working with potential project proponents to identify initiatives that would be aiming to support that trade diversification, including the doubling of Canada's exports.
Now, is Transport Canada doing
Sorry,
anything?
MP, I would love to let you go. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. MPSSC for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you also to our witnesses today. Very grateful that you could appear before us. Now, right off the bat, I just wanted to clarify one thing. As I understand it, for a port owner or operator to have facilities, they are responsible for proper detention and for proper examination of goods coming in. So the onus appears to be on operators and owners of docks and ports. Is that correct?
So yes, port terminal operators would, for the most part, have the care and control of cargo entering and exiting through their terminals.
But for all the equipment, whether it's state-of-the-art, whether it's laser, the onus is on them to actually make all the necessary arrangements, correct?
I would have to defer to CBSA for the precise investments that are required by individual terminal operators.
But this isn't a question of investments, it's a question of who has the obligation. So as I understand, under the Customs Act, there is a provision that says the owners or the operators of a port are responsible for these things.
Standing, but I would have to defer to CBSA.
So if you could kindly follow up with us and just clarify that, that would be much appreciated. My follow-up question is, as you know, on the St. Lawrence Seaway, we have approximately 100 ports and docks. So currently, after Budget 2025, there is a mandate to identify how to expand our capacity for incoming and outgoing cargo. So given that there are 3 different departments that are responsible for identifying and assessing various ports and docks, what are the criteria as you look at all these various options?
So I think what I would turn to in terms of how we're looking at these initiatives, we would look, for example, to the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund. What I would say is that we're looking for projects that expand trade and transportation infrastructure that will help Canada reach global markets, projects that would reduce traffic congestion and delays.
No, I appreciate that. That's why I prefaced it by saying there are 100 different docks and ports. So I presume that the 3 departments together are going through this list. And how do you decide between the various ones? Because I think it would be inconceivable for resources to be provided to all 100. So in terms of looking at the comparative advantages of each one of these docks or ports, how do you assess them vis-a-vis one another, and which ones to proceed with?
So we have been looking at things on a corridor basis to identify issues along corridors. And to the extent that, you're looking at potential areas where there may be congestion or choke points, those would certainly be priorities when we are talking to potential project proponents. that would be interested, for example, in addressing issues. And that may require the expansion of CBSA services as a part of that initiative. But as I said, like a part of this is happening under the first tranche of first phase of the first stream, I should say, of the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund.
Would it be correct to presume there are questionnaires that you're sending out to each one of these operators or owners who are interested in expanding their services? So what is the process that goes into it?
Like I said, the analysis is twofold. There is an analysis that is done at a corridor level that is not like looking at the individual ports. It's more about kind of the issues along corridors to identify potential choke points, congestion areas, as I said. The Stream 1 of the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund is by invitation, and it is looking at reaching out to potential project proponents that may have projects that would help address those issues.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you. 2.5 minutes to Ms. de Bellefeuille. When Godiard Bridge was being built, 46 officers were requested. And the response was the Port of Montreal has been expanded. Now officers need to be trained for that expansion. To my mind, that is a strategic decision that decides either yes or no whether the operations are going to be expanded for specialized ports along the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes. So I don't necessarily share your opinion that this is under the mandate of the CBSA. So if there are 2 containers with minerals on a vessel who go to the Port of Montreal and they are cleared, then there's no congestion. Then those containers go to a truck, and then they go to Valleyfield to deliver the goods. So do you believe, Ms. Reid, sincerely, that way of fighting congestion would not be simpler? Wouldn't it be simpler to give Valleyfield 2 officers, which would be only 4 days' work per month, to succeed in helping the Port of Montreal in this way, to help them give clearance to 2 or 3 containers? Don't you find that that would be more reasonable through a resources standpoint to adopt these innovative solutions instead of making these containers go through Montreal?
Thank you for that question. I think my understanding, and CBSA, and I understand that they may have responded to similar questions while they were here, would be best placed to kind of speak to kind of the whole infrastructure that needs and the equipment that needs to be able to support the presence or the
Non, Madame Reid, je
function.
vous parle pas d'équipement, je vous parle de flux.
No, Ms. Reid, I'm talking to you about the fluidity of the supply chain, which is your strategic role. I'm talking to you about a vessel that stops in the Port of Montreal to get 2 containers cleared, and this vessel is completely filled with bulk cargo, and then those 2 containers would go to the Port of Valleyfield. Do you find that that would be logical and that would make the supply chain more fluid? This is a strategic and political decision on the part of the government. Unfortunately, we have already exceeded 2.5 minutes, and the floor now goes to MP Ao.
Ms. Reid, thank you for your attendance. And in your opening remarks, you talked about the 5 areas of your mandate, right? Which is safety, security, efficiency, environment, and also technological advancement. So I want to ask you, do you do self-assessments from time to time? And if you do, based on what measures do you use to measure your performance? And what has been your most recent assessment of your performance in these 5 areas? If 1 is very good, 5 is very bad. So what has been the assessment on these 5 areas?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. I think in respect of kind of the performance of the department across the full spectrum of its mandate, I would refer to the departmental planning and reporting process, which explains how we have met different targets under the various elements of our mandate.
Terms, can you confirm that the mandates have been largely met?
Once again, I think our departmental performance reports demonstrate how and to what extent Transport Canada is fulfilling its role within the Government of Canada and pursuant to its legislation and its programming mandate.
Okay, and you mentioned that your focus is on supply diversification as a focus. And you know that this is the committee concerning public safety and national security. So sometimes I think those go like efficiency and security could be in conflict. So we know that CBSA has said that the scanning of containers in and out of the country has been very limited. So again, from your perspective as Transport Canada, do you think that's a very acceptable situation?
I would defer to CBSA in terms of their, the getting the balance right between
But from
the fluidity
your
of
perspective, right? Of course, they would have the points of view, but from your perspective, from the Transport Canada's perspective, the limited scanning of containers in and out of the country, is that acceptable?
What I would say is that Transport Canada is going to be working with CBSA and with Global Affairs Canada to ensure that we have the infrastructure and the services in place to support our trade diversification objectives.
Okay, I hope that for my next question, you won't defer it to another department. My colleague has mentioned that the time for clearance has been a problem in the Port of Montreal. So again, my question is, do you have a standard for the Port of Montreal for the clearance time? Do you have a standard? And if you do, what has been the performance?
Yeah, my understanding is that the general standard is about 3 days in terms of dwell time for clearance of different containers through the Port of Montreal.
Do you have any data about the actual performance? What percentage would have to go for more than 4 days?
If I can jump in, Mr. President, the 3D standard includes the time the container is on dock to the time it's put on rail and evacuated from the port. So it includes the clearance. We're not aware of any clearance issues. It's more a question of evacuating through rail or through truck the container from that port.
My colleagues has already pointed out that there's a problem with the time for clearance. And you're saying that there's no problem?
Well, we're not aware of a clearance,
Specific
issues of clearance.
So can I ask for more information in that respect, that you come back to us with more information?
Certainly, we can provide more information regarding the dwell times and the process.
Thank you.
Thank you, MP Ao. And to finish, MP Belowski for 5 minutes, please.
So I'm one of the 2 MPs from Thunder Bay. So if you look at a map and see where ocean-going boats can go, how far inland they can go, we're really lucky with our geography. Thunder Bay is right in the middle of the continent, as is Duluth. And yet we basically take no containers in Thunder Bay Port, even though if you look at, from my understanding from shipping people, increasingly over the years, you've gone from bulk cargo to container cargo. And yet, if Thunder Bay Port wants to bring in something in containers, and sometimes they have to, for example, they brought in a windmill, they bring in the big windmill turbines, but the individual parts come in containers, so they have to go to Duluth instead of Thunder Bay. So, and my understanding is basically there's very few containers on the Great Lakes. which leads me to, are you familiar with this report by the Chamber of Marine Commerce, Unlocking the Potential of Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway, Economic Analysis of Container Reception Services in 6 Eastern Canadian Ports? Are you familiar with that?
Yes, we are.
Do you agree with their numbers?
We've had a number of meetings with the Chamber of Marine Commerce, or we have met, I should say, with the Chamber of Marine Commerce and Avisio regarding their report, and feel it's an important contribution to the discussion around enhancing competitiveness of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region, including on the topic of increasing CBSA services. As I noted, when we're looking at the expansion of services, it requires an assessment of multiple variables. We understand from Avisio that certain of their conclusions, they didn't have necessarily all of the data that would be able to support final determinations.
Okay, thank you. So their numbers overall look pretty good. Summary of net economic impacts of container reception services at various ports. This is Quebec, Valleyfield, Picton, Hamilton, Windsor, Goderich. Value added, $131 million, I guess that's per year. Business income, $132 million. Household disposable income, I guess because more efficient movement of goods, $355 million. And then they go port by port. Picton, Goderich, Hamilton. All, they give pretty good numbers about the economic benefits. I would point out Quebec City, they said the federal government could recover all costs of putting in a CBSA port in just 2 months. So I'm kind of a little mystified why we're not doing this. And on top of that, if you look at, and they give some other examples of how this improves efficiency, decrease greenhouse gas emissions because you're going by water, supply chain efficiency, and we've talked about delays in the Port of Montreal, and their numbers, according to them, Canada consistently posted the highest median port time for container ships from averaging 1.6 to 1.8 days. Montreal's 3 days, and Canada certainly longer delays in the United States, Germany, Italy, France. And anyhow, there seems to be, and the cost for CBSA, isn't it fairly minimal? Like I'm just wondering, why don't we get out of second gear here? It's not a big investment. There's potentially significant economic benefits from opening CBSA posts. Why? And if we're not doing it, when can we hope that we're going to get some answer as to if we're not, why not, and when we're going to start this?
So my understanding is that there were some data limitations in the report regarding the CBSA, the cost of CBSA requirements for infrastructure and labor to implement proposed services. So as a result, those weren't necessarily reflected in the analysis. Because of that, Transport Canada isn't in a position to be able to validate the revenue projections presented in the report or the financial sustainability of implementing individual proposed projects.
Position in order to verify the numbers and say whether this is a good financial idea. Who is? I mean, isn't that the role of our government? If we're going to look and you're being asked to provide a service to help industry, shouldn't we be doing that? I mean, who else do we? And if you're not going to trust their numbers anyhow, I mean, why bother asking them?
I'm sorry. I just want to be clear. Are you asking me why we asked Avisio for their numbers?
No, well, you're saying I think you said you were in no position to verify the numbers and the financial, and whether this was financially a wise move. Well, isn't that the role of our government if we're looking to provide government services? If part of what we're trying to do is contribute to trade diversification and improving our economy, shouldn't we be doing that?
We would do that based on a comprehensive business case if it were presented to Transport Canada. As I noted, we have discussed with Avisio and the Chamber of Marine Commerce the work that they did through this study so that we could better understand their numbers. We understand there were some data limitations. And as a result of that, we can't necessarily say that, we can't validate their revenue projections in terms of the economic benefits. However, as if those individual cases come forward in the context of a business case, we would be able to validate the process through that. We wouldn't necessarily base it on the Avisio study, although it is a very valuable indicator.
Thank you for that. Thank you again, Monsieur Curonier, Madame Reid, and Madame Moriarty for this presentation, all the work that led to it. We wish you a good end of the day. We'll suspend for a few seconds for the time it takes for you to leave and for the other witnesses to come in. Thank you. Merci de votre.
Thank you for being back with us. We can now begin our second hour with 4 guests from 3 different associations, beginning with Mathieu Paquette, partner, and Guillaume Chartrand, senior consultant of Avisio Consulting. We also have James Hamilton, executive director of the Used Car Dealers Association of Ontario. And finally, we welcome John Todd, Vice President for Operations Eastern Canada of VIN Verification Services Incorporated. Thank you very much to all of you for coming to our committee and for preparing for this important sitting. And we will begin with opening statements of 5 minutes for each of the 3 organizations. We'll begin with Mr. Paquette, please.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for welcoming us today. My name is Mathieu Paquette. I'm partner at Avisio Conseil, and I'm an economist. I'm joined by my colleague Guillaume Chartrand, senior consultant and economist. Over the past months and years, we have had the privilege of supporting several ports in conducting economic studies. Recently, in partnership with the Chamber of Marine Commerce, we published a study. This study analyzed the economic impacts of container reception services in 6 ports in Eastern Canada. The study was in a very particular context. Canada is facing a major investment and productivity challenge. Since the pandemic, Canada's productivity growth has lagged behind that of the United States. At the same time, the country is seeking to strengthen its economic resilience, to improve the flow of its supply chains, and to further diversify its trading partners, including through maritime corridors. Some responses to these challenges involve long-term transformations, including artificial intelligence, but others can deliver gains more quickly. Improving trade logistics is one of those concrete levers. It requires relatively limited investment, yet it can have a rapid impact on productivity in the business sector. Our role as economists is to examine the economic impact of these services. We do not assess these projects from an operational implementation standpoint, and the study was not intended to be a market study. The central point of the study is straightforward. Container gate services are, first and foremost, a lever for economic efficiency. They allow goods that have already been traded to move directly, more quickly, and more reliably, and in many cases at a lower cost as well. For importers, this can mean more affordable inputs and or better controlled lead times. For exporters, it can mean improved access to containers, smoother logistics, and enhanced competitiveness in international markets. And for the economy as a whole, it translates into productivity gains that ripple through the economy, benefiting businesses, households, and governments. So these mechanisms affect the productivity of firms and sectors that would use container services at the port studied. To measure these effects, we used computable general equilibrium models. The main impact mechanisms take the form of reduced transport times, lower logistics costs, improved allocation of empty containers, greater system flexibility, or more efficient use of existing maritime capacity. To measure these effects, as I said, we used computable general equilibrium models. These are from Quebec, Ontario, and Canada. This is a type of model that the most major public administrators maintain. Therefore, our results can be readily replicated. One of the key findings of our study is that these projects have the potential to generate recurring economic benefits through relatively targeted interventions. They also contribute to broader effects that are particularly relevant to the work of this committee: stronger supply chain resilience, better diversification of points of entry, reduced pressure on the road network, and enhanced economic security for the country. In addition, beyond the economic impacts presented in our study, many stakeholders also emphasized to us the importance of ensuring redundancy in access to containerized goods along the St. Lawrence Great Lakes corridor. We also paid close attention to the issue of costs related to the CBSA. As detailed information was not available for each project, we adopted a prudent approach based on the Halifax case. Even under a conservative scenario in which CBSA costs would be of the same order of magnitude as those associated with the expansion carried out at the Port of Halifax, the analysis shows that the economic and fiscal benefits remain significant. Finally, it is worth recalling that our study builds on work initiated upstream. Port congestion has been identified at the national level as a strategic priority for improving the performance of Canada's supply chain. Thank you. We're pleased to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Paquet. Mr. Hamilton, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee. My name is James Hamilton. I'm the Executive Director of the Used Car Dealers Association of Ontario. We represent and advocate for nearly 5,000 motor vehicle dealers, new and used, lessors, recyclers, rental companies, and associate members across the province of Ontario, with some members outside of Ontario as well, across Canada. As this committee studies the Canadian Border Services Agency's role in maritime trade and port practices, we want to address a critical security gap, speaking to a data piece. That's vehicle identification number cloning and revinning. Some of you have likely read about or heard about this in the media as a growing phenomenon, likely the result, frankly, of organized crime pivoting from away from the ports, where we've seen some success in stolen vehicle intervention, and they're just simply shifting to other means. This is a scam in which thieves will use legitimate vehicle identities to disguise a stolen or salvaged car, making it appear legal to sell. Essentially, criminals create a fake VIN plate and ownership documents to match a similar vehicle in another jurisdiction, or at least with a VIN that decodes as a real VIN. They can then sell that stolen vehicle with a cloned VIN to an unsuspecting buyer here in Canada, and oftentimes those buyers are our members, the dealers, who are often on the front line of the transaction. Ultimately, the consumer is the one who's going to be harmed, however. It can lead to innocent buyers being denied insurance in the event of an accident, or when they have to make a claim, or the vehicle is confiscated by law enforcement because it is in fact stolen, and eventually the law enforcement folks track it down. CBSA maintains a database of VINs of every vehicle exported from Canada. In order to help law enforcement identify stolen vehicles and reduce the flow of revenue to organized crime groups, our association is presently seeking a data sharing arrangement with CBSA to make use of that data. This would enable our members, for example, to search if a VIN on a vehicle that they're thinking of buying has already been exported, which would be a red flag to them that it's likely a clone or a revinned stolen vehicle. They wouldn't, of course, buy it. Instead, what they would do is alert law enforcement officials to a potential problem car. VINs from exported vehicles are particularly useful. And the reason is because they're real VINs on a vehicle that really existed and that's no longer here in Canada. So it's ripe for use on a stolen car. It's not unlike using a deceased person's identity to create identity theft or fraud, because it's an identity that's real. The VIN was real. It's just not here anymore. So they're ideal, and we have seen instances where these VINs are appearing on vehicles that are being purchased by dealers, and we think this is a way, yet another way, for dealers to have a data source to protect against that. It's not going to solve all the problems. As was mentioned earlier in this session, auto theft is a complicated and complex issue, and there's no one single solution. And when somebody ever suggests that there is, that's probably misleading. But this is another piece, and it's easy to do because the data is there. Currently, the CBSA is sharing that data, the very data I speak of, with private, foreign-owned entities and insurers, but they deny it to Canada's own registered dealers through our association, the very people who could flag these ghost vehicles at the point of trade-in and before resale. The UCDA attended the Federal Theft Summit held in Ottawa in February of 2024, And this was at the height of the auto theft crisis, which was particularly virulent in Ontario and Quebec at the time. The Port of Montreal featured prominently as a focal point of concern at that time as well. Much has been accomplished, as I mentioned, since then, and auto theft numbers have been going down, thanks in large part to efforts to make illegal export more difficult for criminals at the ports. Equite, who some of you may know are very active in the auto theft file and have a lot of good data, have suggested auto theft in Ontario is down 20%. But we need to be cautious about celebrating too much, because auto theft in Canada still represents approaching $1 billion loss in 2025 to insurers. Criminals are nothing if not flexible. Revenues derived from stolen vehicle activity account for the third largest source of revenue for organized crime, after drugs and guns, and they use that money to fund drugs and guns anyways. They're not going to forego that revenue just because one avenue is closing to them. They simply pivot, and they're doing this by focusing more intently on the domestic market for stolen cars. It is still the case today that a VIN on a stolen car could be registered in Ontario with an exported VIN, because MTO in Ontario doesn't know that that VIN was exported, because they're not getting that data from CBSA either. In 2024 at the summit, the CBSA agreed that data is a major tool in the fight against auto theft. We agree, and we would like to be a partner with CBSA in protecting consumers in Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Todd, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the role of CBSA in the H2O highway corridor. Today, at the same time, I've already provided a bio of my experience. I appear before you to offer a clear and candid assessment of where the current system is failing and where meaningful improvement is both possible and necessary. The reality is straightforward. The system is not working, and the data is unequivocal. In 2024, CBSA intercepted approximately 2,200 stolen vehicles, roughly 4% of the more than 57,000 vehicles that were stolen nationally that year. In 2025, that interception rate fell below 3%. This decline persists despite prior testimony before this committee that indicating that 60% of the stolen vehicles are destined for export, primarily through the Port of Montreal. Organized crime exploits predictable weaknesses in the export control system. Vehicles are falsely declared as household goods or electronics. Containers are loaded inland, blended in with legitimate cargo. Export documentation can be altered after the vessel leaves and departs. Most critically, many stolen vehicles are re-VIN'd with VIN'd or clones altered, and cannot be detected by X-ray scanners. Only physical inspections and document verification can identify them, yet such inspections occur far too infrequently. CBSA relies upon a risk-based inspection model. However, physical examinations are conducted on fewer than 4% of the outbound containers, sometimes often less. Past audits have indicated that many high-risk electronic lookouts are not referred to secondary inspection. These are systemic vulnerabilities that organized crime and criminal networks have learned to exploit. As a result, Canada's ports are increasingly becoming used as criminal gateways. The Port of Montreal, for example, processes roughly 70% of Canada's legitimate vehicle exports, but remains the epicenter for stolen vehicle activity. However, the problem is no longer confined to a single port. Halifax has experienced a sharp rise in vehicle-related financial fraud. Container traffic through St. John has more than doubled. Vancouver, Canada's largest container port, physically inspects a small fraction of the outbound shipments. The pattern is unmistakable. Where enforcement presence is limited or inconsistent, criminal exploitation exists and thrives. The absence of a visible deterrent becomes the invitation. These risks are accelerating as Canada's port network expands and global trade patterns are shifting. To be clear, CBSA faces a genuine operational and legal constraints. It cannot inspect every container. Current scanning technology cannot verify VIN integrity. Export data sharing remains limited. Training standards and investigative tools have not kept pace with the sophistication of modern criminal networks. This is not a failure of CBSA officers by any means, but it is a failure of the system design. The private sector can play a role, a constructive role, but only if it's done correctly. Let me be unequivocal. Under current laws, private companies cannot and should not exercise enforcement authority in the ports. The outsourcing of enforcement functions risks legal challenges, charter violations, compromised prosecutions, and these are real concerns raised with CBSA. However, there is a viable and alternative options. Qualified private sector partners can augment CBSA capacity through expertise, technology, scale, provide the enforcement authority remains firmly with CBSA and governance is clearly defined. Elements of this approach already do exist. That model, however, carries legal risks, lacks scalability, transparency, and as a result, and has resulted in limited and inequitable access to government-derived data. With proper oversight, the model can be modernized. Trusted private sector partners can support CBSA through advanced analytics, AI-driven targeting of pre-screening, standardized national training support, and most critically, scalable vehicle examinations across all ports, not just the Port of Montreal. This is not privatization, it's force manipulation, multiplication. When criminals believe detection is likely at any port, their behavior will change. It is possible to reduce random inspections and trade delays, increase capacity without major new infrastructure. VIN fraud is detected more efficiently, public confidence improves, and transparency and measurable outcomes. In closing, I respectfully offer to the committee 5 recommendations for your consideration. First, mandate a national standardized training model for CBSA officers focused on consistent, defensible, risk-based targeting. Secondly, fully implement the mandatory 72-hour advance export filing to finally close off the post-departure documentation loophole. Thirdly, expand VIN data sharing under strict governance to additional trusted private sector partners for anti-fraud purposes. Fourthly, establish fair and transparent service level agreements for inspection facilities, qualified vehicle examinations to standardize timelines, costs, and accountability. And finally, create the conditions to pilot a private sector augmentation model focused on VIN examinations, significantly increasing capacity without transferring authority. Stolen vehicles continue to leave Canada not because CBSA lacks commitment, but because the system lacks scale, transparency, modern tools, and consistency. To be clear, the process needs to urgently adapt. With those, I'll close there and thank you and welcome your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, which enables us to turn to MP Lloyd for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'm going to start with maybe Mr. Todd and Mr. Hamilton. So to clarify, it's not necessarily stolen exported vehicle VINs that are being used. This could be legally exported vehicle VINs are being used to clone VINs from stolen vehicles in Canada. Is that correct?
Those would be the desirable VINs to use because they don't have, by virtue of the fact that they're legitimate, any kind of a stain on them. And they can create a title chain that looks legitimate, at least at first blush.
So how does organized crime know what these VINs are of these exported vehicles?
I would have to speculate where they get them from, but I would imagine it's probably unscrupulous exporters, which CBSA are not unaware of. You may have heard last year that they fined one particular exporter almost $40 million for having exported 2,400 vehicles without ever declaring them properly through the system. So there's a person who might, for a few dollars, share a VIN.
So criminal actors are getting VINs potentially from exporters, and then they're using those VINs to clone vehicles in Canada. Okay. Now, I raised this issue with Aaron O'Gorman from the CBSA, and when I'm looking at a vehicle, I can go on the CPEC website and type in the VIN of any vehicle, and it will tell me if it's stolen. That's public information. But does that list contain a list of exported vehicle VINs?
No. If it did, I wouldn't need to be here today.
Exactly. And so I just wonder, when I asked the president of the CBSA why the exported vehicles were not, those VINs were not being made available so that the public or stakeholders such as yourself could check, I was being told that there was privacy concerns. What are the privacy concerns of sharing those VINs?
I know John will probably have something to say. I can certainly briefly say that I don't believe there's a privacy concern if the question is, was it exported, yes or no? Is it stolen, yes or no? It's yes or no. We're not asking for the owner. We're not asking for any personal details, addresses. In our case, in a perfect world, we would be told the vehicle was exported to Germany on this date, and that's all.
Would it be safe to say, this might sound like a dumb question, but if a vehicle's been exported to Germany and somebody's trying to register that vehicle or sell that vehicle to a used car dealer in Brampton, it's likely that that is a stolen vehicle, correct?
Correct. And I'll give you a brief anecdote. A fellow who did work for me as a contractor bought a pickup truck from a private seller, and he registered it in Ontario. He plated it and insured it. And about a year and a half after he bought it for several $1,000s, it's one of these extended cab pickup trucks contractors desire, it was stolen from him. His insurance coverage was denied. And when we ran the VIN through the limited resources we've got, we determined that that was in fact exported to Germany in 2021. So the VIN on that truck was already exported years before he bought it in 2023. And he was able to register it at Service Ontario because MTO doesn't have the VINs from CBSA either. And
so maybe a great first step would be if CBSA would share these exported VINs with the registry agents across Canada.
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of purely to be altruistic, I don't see any reason why it should be a monetization issue.
Okay, so let's get back to that. So CBSA is currently providing exported VIN data. This is Canadians' data. It's being provided to two organizations, Equite and Carfax Canada. And what does Carfax Canada use those vehicle exported VINs for?
They will take that data and combine it with a vast array of other data that they have. Carfax sits on massive amounts of data, which is a good thing, by the way. If it weren't for Carfax, it would be a lot more difficult for dealers to do their due diligence, but the cost of assembling all that data is high. They make it part of their fraud tool that you will see if you do a Carfax. It'll say this vehicle has questions, one of which might be that it was exported. Why are you looking at it now in Ontario?
But basically, the government of Canada is enabling a monopoly to exist because they're providing this information to one company, and this company is then packaging that public information in their vehicle reports that your stakeholders are paying for to access that.
That's correct. And in case my members would just pass that cost on to consumers.
What was the estimated cost of that to Canadian consumers, you'd say?
We're talking millions of dollars in this kinds of business activity. The Carfax search is around $46 to $48. Yes, for each VIN they search.
Okay. Now, Mr. Todd, did you have any thoughts on this that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I agree with what James has said regarding the access to the VINs that are exported. That you can walk through any Costco or any parking lot across Canada, and you can check the VIN. It's open to public display. The same thing applies with searching your vehicle. Any of us can go online to the CPIC public site and search a VIN number to determine whether it's stolen or not. So I'm not so clear on what the issues would be regarding the confidentiality of those VINs.
Yes. Now, did you have any more recommendations? I mean, you gave us 5 very good recommendations on, but what I've been told is like sometimes the registry agents aren't even checking the CPIC website to see if a vehicle's stolen. They're just going ahead and registering these vehicles.
Yes, sir. In some provinces, that is correct. I think that the registry offices lack the analytic capability at the desk. And I'll take Ontario, for example. You have 300 and something Service Ontario desks with multiple counter staff. They're products that they're responsible for from A to Z. There's a lineup out the door usually. They're not trained to be fraud investigators. They're not trained to be auto theft investigators. I think that's a good start, is to be able to give them the tools at their desk to be able to identify these or potentially stolen vehicles.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. Now let's turn to MP Ramsey for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton and Todd. Very interesting. My question to Monsieur Paquet. Monsieur Paquet, vous étiez présent?
Mr. Paquet, were you here for the prior presentation? I'm trying to understand what economic analysis Transport Canada had done, and in the data I saw there was a logistical, technical analysis. I didn't understand the technical analysis. You might have understood it better than I did. So what type of technical analysis is Transport Canada doing, in your opinion? When I met with Transport Canada, that's not something that we discussed. They criticized your analysis. Do you have any response to that? Yes, I was somewhat surprised. If you read our study, you will see that there is a lot of methodological explanation. We were very transparent, and we were transparent with Transport Canada. We can discuss it with them further if they wish. But in all of the methodological choices that were taken in our study, we were always very, very conservative and prudent in the estimations that we arrived at. So we're wondering, if in 5 years we see the real results, I think they would be much better than the prudent estimations that we projected. Just to help me understand well, in your analysis, do you take into consideration the economic development of the region that surrounds the port? No. So all of the lever effects and what you're mentioning would be the same thing that stakeholders have told us. If these projects go forward, they will be more interested in investing. And this will be an economic driver. It drives up GDP. And we wanted to be prudent in our projections. And I would also add that all of the additional budget spending was not even taken into account. So I don't want you to speculate, but I do want to ask a question to you. So this economic development, and I don't want to presuppose your answer, but it would increase the numbers that you landed on. Yes, you would be correct to suppose that if we took into account other variables, that then the resulting number would be higher. Okay, so can you talk to us further about the results that you obtained? So in terms of added value, so GDP, these are annual outcomes. All of these outcomes come from productivity gains for the 6 ports in our study. So 60 million in GDP for Quebec City, 5.2 for Valleyfield, 10 million in Hamilton, 24.6 in Windsor, so it's over $30 million recurringly. The government revenue federally would be around $79 billion for 6 ports. So how many could benefit from the measures that you are referring to in your study on the St. Lawrence and in the Great Lakes? That is a good question. I'm sure other ports could be interested, but the study was on 6 ports. Okay, that's all. Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. Ms. de Bellefeuille, for 6 minutes, please. Are you not going to carry over whatever was left from his time to me? Thank you very much to you, sirs, for testifying. Mr. Paquet, earlier I wasn't at ease when I was listening to Transport Canada's testimony. It looks like your study is very serious. You're a well-known firm by the government. So I have a question for you. Do you consider that your economic analysis is pessimistic, optimistic, or realistic? For the reasons that I've already said, it was certainly very prudent and conservative. So if we look at the expected outcomes, we are at the more conservative and prudent end of the scale. As I said, we were also very transparent, and the literature gave us 0 to 2.4. We could have taken the highest, we could have taken the median, but we always chose to go with the lowest figures on the scale available to us. So we were very prudent. I was trying to discuss the fact that the Port of Montreal is complementary to the Port of Valleyfield. I was trying to discuss this with Transport Canada, given the proximity between Montreal and Valleyfield. Could you please speak to that? Yes, I was listening to you, and I found that you gave a very good example. So to follow up on the answer, the Port of Montreal is a voluminous port, but there are also advantages of using specialized ports, including Valleyfield, which is a specialized port. They have very specialized vessels, and the cargo that is handled in Valleyfield could be handled in an expedited way. So I'm sure a request would have to be made to the Port of Montreal, but this request to handle goods, given that there's such a high volume in the Port of Montreal, that could be supplementary. You would have to confirm with the Port of Montreal. Can you please confirm to what extent your conclusions for the Port of Valleyfield are sensitive to the cost you estimated for providing mobile inspection services? That's a good question. I would say they're not very sensitive at all. And there is an excellent part of the analysis that shows how we arrived at the figure that we arrived at for CBSA. So we found that there would be a $5.2 billion impact on the GDP. And even if we were mistaken, even if the costs annually for the CBSA were 5 times what we estimated, if we look at the ratios, the costs for the government for the CBSA, if you compare it to the revenue that the government would gain every time, it's still an excellent ratio. The CBSA has often told us that for the CBSA, it's not optimal to invest in the Port of Valleyfield. There are so many requests. There are so many requests for officers. They say that requesting 2 officers twice a month is not a good investment, but you say exactly the opposite in your study. Yes, and I would even go further. What we measured in the study was productivity for goods that would go through Valleyfield, but there would potentially be gains for the Port of Montreal for the reasons that I mentioned if it were able to concentrate on higher volume goods. So in your view, what would be the impact of opening up services on regional development? It would certainly be a positive impact, and I know that my colleague has looked into this, so I'll give him the floor. Thank you for your question. I think better access to infrastructure strategically would be very beneficial for various regions in the study. So access to clearance is limited to one corridor, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. So when we're able to bring the production point closer to the service point, it's more affordable for the consumer, and it's easier to access empty containers, which can then be used for importing and exporting more efficiently. So for all of these reasons, direct investment and foreign investment are more attractive, and the Port of Valleyfield is an example. General Davalic, there's a $7 million investment anticipated, and this would be a specialized port able to deal with clearance for imported goods. Do I have any time remaining, Mr. Chair? I'm pleased that you're giving a concrete example, because it is true that the government is investing several $1 million to General Dynamics, and the Port of Valleyfield is an important tool to be able to receive goods from abroad. We could also take the example of Glencore, which is a neighbor of Valleyfield. Those are examples, indeed. And they're very telling examples. And we don't understand the response of Transport Canada or the CBSA when we ask them if they would be able to open up services to clear a few more containers. You're telling us that business can be done. These are excellent remarks, but unfortunately we need to move on to Ms. Kirkland for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I appreciate Mr. Paquette and Chartrand, your comments regarding Valleyfield, and I'm I don't know if you were here earlier, but I'm part of the Hamilton Oshawa Port Authority, the Oshawa portion of that. So according to Chamber of Marine Commerce study, Unlocking Potential of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway System, the Port of Hamilton Oshawa, and for reference, people always just say HOPA, has completed construction of its container terminal aimed at increasing inland capacity. So what remains, and I'm quoting here, is the part-time presence of CBSA officers on site to conduct container inspections under a sufferance warehouse license, for which the Port Authority resubmitted its application on May 9th, 2025. So we know there is a great economic impact for the Great Lakes region when this license is obtained, and you've made that clear. So according to your study, would the Port of Hamilton Oshawa have a capacity to become a first port of arrival?
Faudrait voir peut-être avec ROPA.
We would have to verify. I imagine that there would be a study specifically on the marine container, but we looked into a different project.
So in terms of a $10 million investment at the Hamilton Oshawa Port Authority, just for clarity, when we're talking about that, we do not mean an investment in Oshawa, we mean an investment in Hamilton. Is that correct?
Investment numbers in the study regarded the Hamilton rail terminal, which is a sufferance warehouse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to clarify that because so often we hear about HOPA, but really it should just be called the HPA sometimes, I think, because Oshawa gets left out of it often. So I'm going to move on. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Mr. Todd and Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton, how often are you seeing cases where stolen vehicles are being revinned or cloned? And you may have mentioned it in your intro, but just to remind us, and then resold into the marketplace, what are our numbers looking like?
I don't have the actual numbers on that. That's something that law enforcement would probably be better placed. And of course, different jurisdictions would have higher incidence. Peel continues to be a hot area, covering Brampton and areas like that. Durham and Oshawa, I think, also has pretty high incidence. I can say, again, from my own experience, that it is, and having spoken to many people in law enforcement, it's not an uncommon thing. It's becoming more of a problem.
Okay, very good. I actually have a follow-up meeting to this with Durham Regional Police and the port, so I'll be talking a little more in depth locally. When a dealer unknowingly buys a cloned vehicle, and just help me understand, what happens next in that transaction? So who absorbs the loss? What are we looking at for the average person?
So if we're talking about a well-done recloned vehicle, something that organized crime has done well enough to get past the process of fooling the dealer into buying it and fooling a consumer into buying it from the dealer, you could be looking at a year or years after that transaction before it's identified as a stolen vehicle. And by then, of course, the bad guy's long gone in the wind. Most of the time, you don't really know who that party was anyways, because they were using false identities and things like that. But the loss would then be visited on the consumer at the first instance, but then the insurance company that underwrites the vehicle, because the police are going to seize that vehicle and they're going to return it to the insurance company that pays out the customer for the loss.
Would you see that this issue would then have an impact on insurance costs or claims then for individuals? And I think I know the answer to that, but just for the study's sake.
Yeah, I think I can guess what the answer would be. If Equite was asked that question, they'd say, $1 billion in auto theft claims alone in 2025 means that somebody's paying that bill, and it's not going to be the insurance companies. It's ultimately passed on to the consumer.
Thank you. And you and Mr. Todd have both made it very clear that the current approach of reactive versus preventive is a real problem. I did not realize that the CBSA does not provide the exported VINs to dealers, let alone the MTO. So that was a shock to me. There was a recent case involving a Service Ontario employee, I don't know if you're aware of it, who used their position to facilitate fraudulent vehicle registrations. It highlights insider access to registration systems. So how significant is the risk posed by individuals with legitimate system access? And either one of you, I'd be happy to answer.
Significant risk is a great question. And I think that the more you can take the ambiguity and the more you can take the discretion away from the service desk, whatever province it's in, have those access to the correct information at that desk, and those vehicles need to be flagged at that point in time. It's not a complex formula to put together. They just need the tools. However, you still come back to the same point that those vehicles can only be identified through a physical examination. And if I just may take up a couple seconds of your time as well, back to your first question, the reality is I don't think anybody really does know how many vehicles are going through the ports. The three main destinations you have outside of a stolen vehicle that's used to commit another crime, the three main destinations you have are the ports, the next one would be the registries, and the next ones are parts. And the idea of building the deterrent in at the port, in at the registry desk, and in the parts market helps offset those costs and the enforcement issues, the enforcement resources that would be spent to try to resolve that. So it's a built-in deterrent, is what we're saying.
Merci, Madame la députée.
That went
Kirkland.
very fast.
Madame Akan pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Chair, all my good questions were asked by Madame de Bellefeuille, unfortunately. So I will move to my riveting questions with Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton, auto thefts in Canada dropped by 18% in 2025, and this is nationwide, and it is driven by a national action plan. So we will see more positive news on those crimes as well. However, my questions are primarily about the issue of revenue, an issue that is impacting exported vehicles and causing heavy burden on both consumers as well as your 5,000 dealership members. In my discussion with the Canadian Financing and Leasing Association, one proactive suggestion was the implementation of a remote VIN plate verification system as a solution of the problem of revenue. The goal is to move from a reactive model to an intelligence-led approach using technology and real-time data sharing, which can be more proactive, as we can imagine. Could you please share with us how a searchable database for exported VINs might improve the system integrity by allowing the dealers to identify the ghost vehicles before they are resold to unsuspecting buyers?
So dealers have, over the years, grown very comfortable with using various pieces of data to try to appraise a vehicle for purchase and for resale. In Ontario, we're a regulated, heavily regulated industry, and they are required to do due diligence. They're not unfamiliar with doing searches to see if a vehicle was in an accident, to see if there's a lien on a vehicle, to see who the previous owners were so they can declare it to the ultimate consumer correctly. This is another data piece, a significant data piece. When we talk about export VINs, for the reasons I've mentioned, it gives them an ability to fairly easily and swiftly determine whether they've got a problematic vehicle. If a VIN on the vehicle they're thinking of buying is showing up as having been exported sometime prior, that vehicle technically shouldn't be in front of them. So there's some question that's raised, it's a red flag, and that's something law enforcement should be looking at. They will come and look at the vehicle and determine if through the hidden VINs that are elsewhere on the vehicle that only law enforcement knows about, if it is a problematic vehicle. What we don't want is the harm that we've discussed ultimately at the consumer end with them having the vehicle seized or having an insurance claim that costs everybody at the end of the day.
Thank you. So UCDA has an interest, as you today also mentioned to us, in having a data sharing arrangement with the CBSA. And your organization, as I mentioned, representing approximately 5,000 dealers of new and used vehicles. So now I know that the CBSA mentioned to you, Mr. Hamilton, that privacy concerns surrounding the VIN's personal information are considered customs information under the Customs Act. In addition, CBSA shares some information with those two organizations, Equite and Carfax, but not all the information. They only share certain amount of information. Could you please elaborate on what a collaborative data sharing arrangement between your organization and CBSA would look like in practice? Specifically, how would your organization's data handling protocols help bridge this information gap while ensuring that the privacy and security standards are strictly maintained?
Speaking for our organization, we're already familiar with security protocols that are required for the handling of that kind of data because we receive from the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario data on plate registration data, data on vehicle ownership, names of people who own the vehicles. We get lien search data from the Ontario government through the different ministry that provides it. And they all have us requiring to have security, cyber protection, privacy protocols where we purge data on a regular basis. We don't hold it longer than we need to. We're sensitive to those issues. I would have to say that we would be as cognizant of those concerns as Carfax is.
Thank you very much for your answer. Mr. Todd,
yes.
One of the steps in combating vehicle theft is our ability to scan and improve our port of entry's ability to process containers. So unfortunately, criminals present themselves as legitimate importer-exporter, acting like brokers, or say that they are in the used car business when exporting through our ports. Could you speak to the importance of intelligence sharing as a tool to catch fraudulent actors or stolen vehicles?
I can speak a little bit to it, not being in the policing and the intelligence community anymore. I think that the more information that's shared is the better. There's no doubt about it. I think that there's some safeguards that have to be put into place, in particular when you're dealing with a private sector company in that type of environment, whether it's part of the insurance industry or not. But that definitely, the greater the information sharing, the better, and it helps build that network of information that can goes back to put together cases long before they reach the ports, for sure.
Merci, Madame la députée Hagan. Sorry to interrupt again. Madame de Bellefeuille, pour 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Alors, 2 minutes et demie, c'est court.
2.5 minutes, that's very short. Mr. Paquet, perhaps in other words, would the government have an economic advantage and be able to generate wealth if it invested to support small and medium-sized ports that are more specialized so that it could boost diversification and increase fluidity of the supply chain? Did your study lead you to that conclusion? We concluded that there would be a tax and GDP gains for Canada, Quebec, and Ontario to open up the CBSA's services in one of the parts of our study. I would also mention that for all of the projects, we're talking about relatively targeted investments. We're not talking about billions of dollars. They're relatively targeted investments which can have an impact and a very quick impact depending on the project. So the $54,000 number for the agents, or the officers rather, who would have to come to Valleyfield a couple of days a month for a couple of containers. We're saying what you're saying is even if it's more expensive, it remains profitable. Yes, so the 45,000, even if you were to multiply it by 4 or 5, it would still be it would still generate more revenue for the government in comparison. So when we look at the real GDP per year, it would still be in the positive, even if we were erroneous in our estimations. Did you know that when it comes to mobile radiation portals, these are legal and they are respecting the agreement with the United States? You know that there's a community close to Valleyfield that has these, so it would be beneficial for Valleyfield to have officers from the CBSA. So how can you explain this resistancy to support this project with Valleyfield? You would have to check with the Government of Canada. We look just at the economic side of the question, and we think that it would be positive economically. Thank you very much for these discussions. Mr. Guild for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you to all the witnesses that are here today testifying. It's been a pleasure to listen in on the discussion today. My first question is going back to the used car dealerships and these dealers. How often are they coming across these compromised cars with these VINs that are compromised? If you could expand on that, please.
It is increasingly common. It isn't to the extent where it's every other deal, for sure, but we mentioned the pivot that organized crime will engage in as it becomes harder for them to easily export stolen cars out of various ports. They're going to pivot. And one of the ways they pivot is in the domestic market. So they're not going to necessarily seek to send it to Dubai. Now they're going to try to sell it to someone in Brampton. And so inevitably, our members are going to see and are seeing this more and more commonly. And they learn about it usually as a result of a police officer attending to seize the vehicle or take it from one of their customers. John Todd mentioned salvage parts. That's a growing concern. Again, organized crime have realized that the constituent parts of a vehicle are worth quite a lot of money. You got catalytic converters and airbags, and these things are worth a lot of money. And so, revinning or cloning can also feed into the salvage and recycle market, and that is a growing concern for that market as well. It has many different tendrils.
Like to expound on that at all?
Yeah, I can add some numbers, some context to that. So in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where we provide the service on behalf of those two governments, we're finding a stolen or re-VIN vehicle roughly on one in every 80 to 90 vehicles, depending on the province. And if you can translate that over to Ontario with its population, with 1 million vehicles being entered onto the registry every year, if we're talking 1 to 2% of those vehicles having a fraudulent VIN or a problematic VIN, cloned VIN, stolen VIN, whatever you want to call it, it adds up very quickly to a large amount of vehicles that are going onto the registry, legitimized, being sold to unsuspecting consumers. And they do require, the only way you can identify them is by a physical examination.
So we see that this organized crime, it pivots and shifts as we see that, the research that the police and all the services that are there trying to make sure that they can get on top of it. You mentioned some pivots. What is your biggest factor of worries given how this is playing out, this organized crime?
If in a perfect world, I'd like to see a national registry where all of the registries, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, BC, are all linked in a way that they can easily determine that a VIN is registered in a certain place at a certain time, and that VIN isn't reappearing, say, in 2 jurisdictions at the same time. Believe it or not, that happens. So you could run a search, say, on Carfax, and it will show a registration in Quebec and BC at the same time, and everyone goes, well, that's a clone. Or we see one in the U.S. and one that's in Ontario, and it's the same VIN. I suppose what I'm saying is that we have the data. It's there. It's just a question of how it's used. Interestingly, when we went to the summit in 24, the federal summit that got this all kicked off this discussion and was quite successful in that regard. There were people in the room that could really make a difference. The RCMP, I learned, were not providing VINs on the CPIC database to Interpol. And they had been asked to do that for many, many years, but they just weren't, or for whatever reason, privacy or otherwise. And within 2 weeks of that conference in February of 24, the RCMP started sharing those VINs with Interpol. It was as simple as throwing a switch. It was low-hanging fruit. Not all these data solutions are going to be that easy, but Interpol found thousands of vehicles in Europe from Canada as a result of that sharing. So it can be meaningful, and it can cost very little to nothing. It's just a question of the will.
Okay, and I also recall how you mentioned how crucial it was that the CBSA data is shared with all organizations just like yourself. I want to understand, why is that being delayed to this extent, and what can we do to make sure that we are taking advantage of the information that we have and collected, because you follow all the measures, you follow all the protocols. What is the roadblocks here?
That's an excellent question to which I wish I had an answer. One of the surprises, I suppose, when we embarked on this was we thought that we were on the side of the angels with the request we were making to CBSA, and I stand somewhat surprised at how difficult it has proven to be to get them to see the advantages. They have never actually told us why they've chosen to share it with Equité and Carfax, but not with organizations like ours. And I'm not suggesting that Carfax and Equité shouldn't have it. Quite the opposite. I think that more should have it that are proper users and can show that they've got legitimate reasons.
Sorry, MP Gill, for that great conversation. Thank you, MP Hamilton. We'll now turn to MP Assassi for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you also to all of our witnesses. Mr. Hamilton, I have to say your remarks have been really fascinating. One of my concerns is, given that you have explained to us the cascading effect that this has, that some of your members are buying these cars because they wouldn't know any better, and then the buyers, obviously there's a caveat emptor, but how can we try to nip this in the bud so that this doesn't happen anymore? Because this is going to tie up the courts. It's going to lead to vulnerable Canadians having to take matters into their own hands. So what can we do to make sure that dealers aren't actually mistakenly dabbling in this stuff?
That again is an excellent question, and it speaks to education. I said earlier on that if CBSA tomorrow were to say, okay, Jim, here's the data, and it's not going to make all of this go away. I never would suggest that. It's a piece, but you're pointing out another piece, and that's education. Dealers in Ontario are now required to take mandatory education. Salespeople and motor vehicle dealers must take every year educational requirements, and part of that education is going to be teaching them how to assess a vehicle correctly, what to look for. There are some identifying features you can look for with a re-VINed or cloned vehicle, and as John has more experience in the enforcement side, the plates that are on the dashboard, these VIN plates, are very specific with rivets that are proper. If they're really well done, they can fool, but not an expert, but ordinary people. But some of them are not so well done. And if they were educated to look for that and to compare them to the dash or what's the VINs on the plate, if you look in the driver's door, there's a plate. You can look in the trunk, there's a plate. And sometimes the more sloppy criminals won't bother even fixing those. So you'll have a VIN on the dash that doesn't match the one on the door. That's a red flag. So the simple things like that could be done.
Thank you. I also have to say that I agree with you that privacy considerations shouldn't get in the way of the CBSA actually sharing some information, but that has to be determined. My next question, you did allude to the fact that in 2024, we had a summit. The numbers are down 20%. But I'm of the view that that's far too little. There's got to be more that we can be doing to improve those numbers. So from a technology standpoint, for our authorities to do a better job, trying to get in the way of these criminal gangs and making sure that cars aren't stolen and exported. From an equipment standpoint, from a high-tech standpoint, what more do we need?
Well, I'm going to defer to John to some extent. I'm
going to ask the same question to John.
Okay, fair enough. I would say that from what I understand, CBSA has some work to do in developing a little bit more of a technology solution to the reporting of VINs. When a vehicle is exported, a lot of it is still self-reporting that's relied on, and informally collected. The VINs are not being collected in an easily digestible way. If you were talking to someone in IT, they would have some solutions to suggest what they would prefer to see with bulk data. My understanding is that they're working on that, but we don't get a lot of information as to what the timelines are with CBSA. I would say that there's a lot of work to be done and probably some money to be spent to make sure that they can more effectively record.
Now we go to Mr. Todd. You actually, in your remarks, you touched on this, that CBSA needs more high-tech tools and equipment. So what would that constitute?
Yeah, great question. I think that this committee's made a number of great recommendations in the past, and I think, going to the scanners, those types of things, I think if I could offer, it's not so much on the technology part. There's people that can provide better advice on that. But as far as the scalability, I think, is the issue that I see. The ability to scale up to be able to examine vehicles with CBSA, and there's part of the issue as well that it lacks any clarity as to the responsibilities. It's very confusing. You heard from other witnesses as to who has the role in the ports to assist CBSA, whether it's the police, whether private sector. You've made a great number of great recommendations. Back to your first question, sir, was, this committee back in 2024 made some really great recommendations. And one of them was, to your first question about how you stop the revinning issue, was every province needs, I think it was Commissioner Karika of the OPP representing CACP, made a recommendation that you adopted that every province needs a legitimate VIN examination program. So when a consumer or somebody comes to a registration desk and there's any issue, those things have to be defined. That formula has to be defined and consistent. But if there's any issue with that VIN, it doesn't get sold. It goes off for legitimate examination before it goes on to an unsuspecting consumer. So if you put that deterrent in place, the criminals will move elsewhere.
Sorry to end that great conversation. For a great concluding comment, thanking you, everyone. Merci beaucoup, messieurs, de vous.
Thank you very much to all of our witnesses for being with us today. You took a lot of time to be with us and to prepare yourselves for this sitting. We wish you a great rest of your day.
For just a few additional seconds, on the timetable, ce jeudi, nous allons continuer avec.
This Thursday, we will continue with our study with more excellent witnesses. And then Tuesday, April 28th, we have the Spring Economic Statement. And for that reason, we will not be sitting on that day. The following Thursday, April 30th, as you may know, we will have the appearance of two ministers, the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Immigration, as part of our study on Canada's ability to deport foreign nationals with a criminal record. And you probably all know that Bill C-22 was passed at second reading yesterday. And now is a good time for members to consider which witnesses they will want to suggest. If you already have suggestions, please send them to the clerk as soon as possible, and have a great day.
Thank you.